All right, let's talk about something that makes a lot of new teachers nervous: rules. And specifically, which yoga rules you should follow, which ones you should question, and how to tell the difference. Can I tell you something that might surprise you? After 15 years of training teachers, I've learned that the most effective yoga teachers aren't the ones who follow all the rules perfectly. They're the ones who understand why the rules exist in the first place and when it makes sense to bend them. But here's what happens to most new teachers. They learn a set of alignment cues or sequencing principles in their training, and they treat them like gospel. Always do sun salutations to warm up. Never do back bends without hip flexor stretches first. Students should hold the key poses for 5 breaths. And look, these aren't bad guidelines, but they become problems when we stop thinking about why we're following them. In much of my work, I talk about this using a food analogy because y'all know I love my cooking metaphors. When you're learning to cook, you need recipes. You follow them exactly because you don't yet understand how flavors work together, what proportions you should be using of the variety of ingredients in the recipe. But as you get more experienced, you start to understand the principles behind the recipes. You know when you can substitute ingredients or adjust cooking times or even completely improvise. Teaching yoga works the same way. You start with the recipes, the sequences and cues you learned in training. But as you gain experience, you need to understand the principles behind them so that you can adapt for the real human students in front of you. Let me walk you through how I approached this with one of my own rules. I was taught that in tree pose, students should never rest their raised leg foot against their standing leg knee. I'm sure you've heard this too. This was repeated as gospel in every training I attended. So I religiously taught this rule for years. Don't put your foot on your knee, I'd say. Move it above or below the knee joint. But then I started asking myself, why not? What exactly was I afraid would happen? So I tried it. Did my chakras spin in the wrong direction? Of course not. I realized that if someone's knee isn't capable of handling the light stress of a foot resting against it, they will be in trouble when they step off a curb and torque it, or when an enthusiastic dog or child runs into them. The rule wasn't serving my students. It was just something I was repeating because I had heard it. Once I understood that students' knees are resilient enough to handle that gentle contact, I could offer that option when it made sense for their bodies. That's what we're talking about when we question rules. Not throwing them out entirely, but understanding them deeply enough to apply them intelligently. Now, here's something I want to add that goes beyond just alignment and sequencing rules. In the workbook key to this course, this questioning process also applies to your assumptions about what teacher training you need, how much you need to know before you start teaching, even what it means to be quote-unquote ready to teach. Let me tell you about something I see all the time. Students finish their 200-hour training and think they need to immediately jump into a 300-hour program because they don't feel qualified yet. But you know what? Sometimes what you need isn't more training, it's more practice. More time actually teaching real students and learning how to adapt to what they need. Or students think they need to be able to do every pose perfectly before they can teach it. But some of the best teachers I know teach from their own limitations, not despite them. These are rules too. They're just different kinds of rules, and they deserve the same kind of questioning. So let's dig into this in your workbook. In the Articulate Your Rules section, there's a table asking you to list what you consider the cardinal rules of yoga, especially asana practice, and then to write down why you believe each one. You may find this is harder than it sounds, and it's supposed to be. You might find yourself writing things like, because my teacher said so, or because that's how I learned it, and that's okay. That's valuable information. It tells you where you might want to do some deeper investigation. But I also want you to think beyond just physical alignment rules. What rules do you have about how much training you need, about when you're ready to teach, about what makes someone qualified to be a teacher? Here's what I want you to try as you work through this. For each rule you list, ask yourself these questions. Where did this rule come from? What problem is it trying to solve? Are there situations where following this rule might not serve my students? Let me walk you through how I approached this with one of my own rules. I was taught that yoga classes should always end with Shavasana. Why? Because students need time to integrate their practice, to let their nervous system settle. That's a solid principle. But then I started teaching lunch hour classes in a corporate setting. Students had exactly 60 minutes, including time to change clothes. By the time we did a full Shavasana, they were rushing to get back to work, stressed about being late. This rule about every class needing to end in Shavasana wasn't serving them. So I adjusted. Instead of Shavasana, we did a few minutes of conscious breathing in a seated position. Same principle, nervous system integration, different application. Now, I want to be really clear about something. Questioning rules doesn't mean ignoring safety or doing whatever feels good in the moment. It means understanding the difference between principles that keep students safe and healthy and methods that might need to be adapted. Some rules really are non-negotiable, like not adjusting students without their expressed consent, or not teaching poses you don't understand well enough to keep students safe, or staying within your scope of practice as a yoga teacher rather than trying to be someone's mental therapist or physical therapist. But other rules, they're more like guidelines, and the more you understand why they exist, the better you can serve your students. This kind of questioning is especially important as you're figuring out your path as a teacher. Maybe you've been told you need to teach at studios to be legitimate. But what if your calling is to teach private lessons or corporate classes or outdoor classes in parks? Maybe you've been told you need to learn Sanskrit and chant mantras. But what if your students need a more secular approach to movement and mindfulness? There is no one right way to be a yoga teacher, but there is your way. And finding that requires questioning some of the assumptions about what yoga teaching should look like. In the workbook, after you've listed your rules and explored where they come from, there's a prompt asking you to do some research. Are there peer-reviewed studies that support your beliefs? Do different yoga traditions take different approaches? What happens when you try alternatives? This isn't about becoming a yoga scholar, though if that excites you, go for it. It's about becoming a thinking teacher rather than just a repeating teacher. Here's a story that illustrates this beautifully. I had a student in teacher training who was convinced that everyone needed to do child's pose as a rest position. She learned that in her own practice, and it became one of her cardinal, unquestioned rules. But in her practice teaching, she had a student who was pregnant, and child's pose was really uncomfortable for her. Instead of insisting on the rule, my student asked wisely what rest position would feel good. The pregnant student said she preferred standing forward fold with her hands on blocks. My student teacher had a choice: stick to her rule or adapt to serve her student. She chose to adapt. And in that moment, she learned something crucial about teaching. It's not about imposing your idea of yoga on others. It's about helping each person, each of your students, find their own version of the practice. That's what questioning rules really gets you: flexibility. Not just physical flexibility, but mental and teaching flexibility. The ability to think on your feet and to serve the students in front of you, not the imaginary, platonic, perfect students in your head. So as you work through this section of the workbook, be gentle with yourself. It's okay to discover that some of your beliefs don't have solid foundations. That's not a failure, that's growth. Every experienced teacher has gone through this process of questioning and refining their approach. And remember, the goal isn't to throw out everything you learned and start from scratch. It's to move from blind following to conscious choosing, to understand your teaching well enough that you can explain not just what you're doing, but why. In our next video, we're going to get practical and talk about creating your professional foundation as a teacher. But for now, dive into those questions. Be curious about rules. Be willing to discover that some things you thought were facts are actually opinions. because that's where real teaching wisdom begins.